So, a railway station canopy collapsed in Serbia, and it caused the prime minister to resign and the government to basically collapse as well. Or if not that, it's on the verge of collapse, maybe. Oh dear God, this is an intro to a video. Okay. Well, my friends, thank you so much for joining me here today. This one is going to require some serious explaining. Luckily, that is exactly what we do here on the History of Everything, so yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now, from the get-go, I know that this video was not in my poll that I put here on my community page, and I know that the option that actually won was the whole issue with Trump and Colombia. I understand that, and I'm going to continue to put more polls out on my page. But even though that one, technically speaking, got the highest number of votes, and I should have done it, the comment section on that poll was absolutely flooded with people telling me to please not do it, that the issue was simply too short and it was very quickly resolved, and that it was just one issue amongst many with the whole deportation thing that is going on in the United States, and that we should wait until more of those happen. There were so many comments that said exactly that, and when I thought about it, I realized that you all were right. This is a history channel that addresses the history behind many geopolitical issues, and if I just went and did Trump Colombia, then, well, at that point I'd pretty much become a news channel just reporting on what is going on. But, that being said, there is a story to tell there. I'm just going to have to wait and then tie that into a bigger video talking about all the different criminal gang members that have been caught and shipped back to their country of origin, because that is a massive thing that has been happening in the United States, and this is a major historical event. It's just, that is something that is going to require more time and research. So, by all means, just please bear with me for a bit, because that is going to be talked about, just not yet. We're going to get more for that story. Anyway, Serbia. I know I got a little bit distracted there. For those of you who have not seen what has been going on, in November of 2024, a series of mass protests began in Novi Sad, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of, and preemptively, before any of this goes further, I'm going to apologize for a lot of my pronunciation for any of these Serbian names. Dear God, it's going to get really messy really fast. But yes, mass protests would break out in Novi Sad following the railway station canopy collapse in the city, which would leave 15 people dead and 2 severely injured. The collapse would lead to widespread public concern in Serbia, with many people questioning the structural integrity and maintenance oversight of public infrastructure. Authorities would subsequently launch an investigation into the causes of the incident, but despite this, public frustration would grow due to perceived lack of accountability in the response, and also with the seeming lack of care from the government. The initial demonstrations were local, but very soon quickly spread to major cities across the country, with protesters demanding official accountability and justice for the disaster. As time went on, and this is an event that did not just settle down, the protests would grow. They would become a wider challenge to the authorities, with students taking a lead role and going and halting traffic daily and blockading universities for months at a time. A general strike was also held, with tens of thousands of people demonstrating in Belgrade. As the protests grew, it not only reflected widespread anger towards the accident and local officials, but specifically wider discontent with the rule of the populist president Aleksandar Vučić and his government. A political crisis is very quickly developing within the country, something that has only grown with time to the point that just this past week, and it's the whole reason why I'm making this video in the first place, the Prime Minister, Milos Vučević, would go and resign after months of these mass protests. Farmers would also go and join striking university students in a 24-hour traffic blockade in Belgrade, showcasing just how much and widespread the population discontent was. Really, the protests have become the biggest challenge to the authorities since the Serbian Progressive Party took power back in the year 2012, and it symbolizes a crack in President Vučić's system of political dominance and demonstrate growing dissatisfaction with his government's handling of various issues, not just this one. We're talking about things including corruption, economic concerns, widespread unemployment, and so much more. And oh boy, again, my friends, when I'm saying this right now, before going and doing research for this episode, I had no idea just how bad corruption was inside of Serbia. Like, I knew it was bad. I knew that it was there, but not nearly to the degree that it is now, especially considering that in episodes that I previously covered with other corrupt countries, this has usually been in places that don't have as developed of a system to be able to track things, whereas in Serbia, a lot of the corruption appears to be just pretty blatant out in the open and televised, practically. So this whole episode was supposed to be a small one, but no, it quickly became a lot bigger than I initially anticipated. Anyway, depending upon what happens, this could have massive implications for foreign relations, as Serbia under Vučić, who for his past 12 years in power has pursued a multi-vector diplomatic course, he is an individual who has been balancing Serbia's relations with the West, China, and Russia. And with potentially this party leaving power, if that happens, who knows what would actually happen to the geopolitical future of Serbia? We don't know. But the bigger question then, as always, is how did we get here? What does the future of Serbia look like in relation to the powers of Europe? And really in general, what the heck is going on? Well, my friends, in order to explain that, we are going to have to go a bit back in time. Not necessarily too much as explaining the entire history of Serbia and the Balkans. Well, that is a powder keg that I have no wish to set off. But of course, that history is still crucial to understanding Serbia today. It's important to understand its politics, and often it's less than happy relations with its neighbors. So, with that, my friends, let's go ahead and dive in. Well, my friends, before we go any further, I'd actually like to talk about something with AI that I find rather interesting. For anyone out there who is a student or something along those lines, who may have used ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or any of those things, have you ever found that when you try to actually use an AI like that in order to be able to do something, research something, get an image of something, that something with the AI seems to stop you or censor you? Admittedly, for the past several years, AI has been a little bit weird at times. Well, my friends, the reason that I bring that up in the first place is because I have actually been sponsored by Venice AI, a generative AI that is actually private and permissionless. Considering how many times that my research has the tendency to veer into, well, war crime territory, something like Venice AI is incredibly useful. It doesn't spy on me, it doesn't censor the AI when I'm trying to figure something out, it is super simple with no downloads and there's no installation of any kind. You can simply access it from your web browser. Basically, what I'm trying to say is go ahead and test this out, and by all means, go and click my link down in the description and check out the pro plan for Venice AI, because the amount of features this thing has is incredibly useful for anyone that is trying to do some work or research. Whether that is uploading PDFs in order to get summaries or insights on it, whether that is being able to turn off safe mode for unhindered image generation, or in general, just having limitless text and high image options, it is truly something that is insane. You can use my link down in the description to go sign up, and I'm actually going to have a link for it right here that you can probably see on the screen. And besides that, my friends, thank you all for watching, and enjoy the episode. Going back to the beginning, the Serbian people have a very long and rich history, something that I most certainly would love to dive deeper into for a full podcast episode, but I don't really have the time for that right now, and I have a feeling I would horribly butcher all the names of the past. But like Germany and Italy, Serbia itself did not become an independent modern nation until the late 19th century. This is the point in which I get many angry Serbs in the comment section talking about the golden age of Serb feudal states from the 13th to the 14th century, but yeah, that's not relevant for this video. So I'm sorry, we are going to have to skip past some things. For centuries, Serbia's proximity to both Europe and Asia made it a target for invaders. Among all of these, the most successful after Rome was the powerful Ottoman Empire, which would make inroads into Serbia during the 14th century and eventually conquered all of it by the mid-15th century. From there, the region would remain under Ottoman control for 3.5 centuries, until the successful Serbian Revolution of the early 1800s. Past that point, Serbia became a self-governing principality in 1830 and an independent and internationally recognized nation-state in 1878. From this point, it and other Balkan states would develop fierce pride in their identity and resistance to foreign powers, a fact that is relevant to this day, and it's why I bring it up in the first place. During this period, modernization efforts would lead to economic growth and infrastructure development, while nationalism would grow amongst Serbs that lived, technically speaking, outside of the kingdom's borders. This would prove to be a bit of a problem for a state by the name of Austria-Hungary, and subsequently a little thing called World War I would eventually break out, which was not necessarily pleasant for anyone. Well, I guess anyone except for the Japanese, that is. Anyway, with the disintegration of the Habsburg Empire at the end of the Great War in 1918, many of the empire's southern Slav minorities sought the protection of the Serbian throne. And from there, they would enter into a union with Serbia as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, etc. in December of 1918, which would eventually become the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929. Now, among all of these, Serbia was easily the dominant part in this multi-ethnic union. Though after World War II, the non-aligned communist government of Josip Broz Tito would give some measures of autonomy to the varying different republics that formed the state, and would attempt to balance contending interests by dividing national administrative responsibilities among different ethnic lines. He was the strongman that held everything together, which is a fascinating story in and of itself, and I need to do an episode on him. But yeah, when he was gone, things didn't hold together. After Tito's death in 1980 and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe over the course of the following decade, resurgent nationalism would reopen old rifts and hatred in Yugoslav society, and Serbian leader, which again I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, Slobodan Milosevic, he would attempt to craft a greater Serbia from the former Union, but his policies instead led to the secession of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Macedonia, as well as a civil war in the early 1990s that would rip the country apart. This was a really bad event, and the civil war would cause the death or displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, prompting international sanctions against the country. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in the late 1990s, even more blood would be spilled when the Albanian Muslim-dominated Serbian province of Kosovo would declare independence, something that would actually result in the intervention by NATO as well as the United Nations, which in turn would lead to the bombing of Belgrade and the placement of Kosovo under UN administration from mid-1999. This is something that would starkly push the Serbs towards looking eastwards for better relations and support, as historically they had been supported by the Russians, and this is something that would drive them away from the West. Milosevic was later defeated in presidential elections, and he was then arrested and tried before the International Court of Justice for War Crimes. But, despite all this being done, the remaining state of Yugoslavia still existed, even if in a very unstable state, as Montenegro would threaten to declare independence before ultimately negotiating an agreement that maintained the country's unification in a loose federation. This, however, was not something that was going to last. During that breakup of Serbia and Montenegro, the contentious matter of Kosovo's future is still something that remained a key part of Serbian politics. From this, talks that began in 2005 did eventually result in a plan, something that was proposed by the UN in 2007 and was supported by the United States and most members of the EU. It is something that called for the independence of Kosovo, albeit under international supervision. Serbia, of course, would reject the plan, and months of further talks between Serbia and Kosovo leaders were inconclusive. They didn't really result in anything. With the support of the EU and the United States, however, Kosovo would declare independence fully in February of 2008. Serbia, backed by Russia, China, and several members of the EU, would refuse to recognize Kosovo as a sovereign country. As you can imagine, with all this political intrigue and everything that is going on, Serbia is in a very unstable state, both politically and economically at this time. In the wake of Kosovo's secession, Serbia's governing coalition, which was composed of the pro-European Democratic Party, the DS, and its offshoot, the center-right Democratic Party of Serbia, the DSS, this completely collapsed. In the aftermath, for a European Serbia, which was a pro-EU bloc led by the Serbian president and DS leader Boris Tadic, this would win nearly 40% of the vote in May of 2008 during the parliamentary elections. Despite this fairly sizable amount, the nationalist Serbian Radical Party would still manage to capture 30% of the vote, which is something that made the formation of a pro-EU governing coalition fairly uncertain. Nevertheless, in July, the pro-EU alliance would join with the socialist-led bloc of parties in order to form a new government whose stated goal was specifically to obtain EU candidacy. Despite everything contentious that had happened in the past, Serbia was slowly but steadily moving westwards. Accordingly, in December of 2009, the Serbian government would officially apply for EU membership. From here then, it is a point that we need to mention some of the economics of what was going on in Serbia here at the time. The Serbian economy, though not great, did show signs of growth in 2010, especially after everything that occurred with the crises of 2008 and the greater financial collapse. This being something that was supported by a new IMF loan, as well as some currency depreciation after a 3% decline in 2009. Nevertheless, despite this growth, unemployment was very high, over 20%, and the austerity-related freezes in public salaries is something that threatened political consequences for the DS party, and that is exactly what happened. You see, the government of Boris Tadic, leader of the DS and the For a European Serbia coalition, they had to deal with the impact of the global economic crisis in 2008 in an economy that was already extremely fragile, coupled with the fact that within his party and general in the state, there were many different corruption scandals that involved the DS, something that horribly pissed people off. And this, my friends, is where we get to start to explain just how horribly corrupt things in Serbia have been and how bad they are to this very day. Now, there are quite a number of studies that have been done on corruption within the Serbian state. But according to one from 2011 by the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, well, they found quite a bit that is very disturbing, to say the least. As just one example, 9 out of 10 Serbian citizens interact with the public administration at some point during the course of the year. This is not the disturbing part, mind you. It's simply saying that 9 out of 10 Serbians will at some point interact with an official affiliated with the government. And in the 12 months prior to that survey in 2011, 13.7% of Serbian citizens had either direct or indirect exposure to a bribery experience with a public official. Like, we're talking over 10% of interactions were quite literally to extract a bribe. Everyone who reports the payment of at least one bribe, on average as well, would actually pay 5 bribes or the equivalent of 1 bribe every 10 weeks or so, which is quite frequent. As for how any of that works, more than half, we're talking 52% of these bribes, were things that were paid in cash, while 1/3, 34% or so, were paid simply as food or drink. Think of like a gift basket or something that would be given. The average cash bribe paid in Serbia would be 15,530 RSD, or the equivalent of approximately 165 euro, which if you fast forward by the 13 years or 14 years that it has been, that is 224 euro or 232 US dollars today, which is a fairly decent amount. Along with this amount, in more than half of bribery incidents, we're talking 56%, Serbian citizens were actually the ones who initiated the payment on their own, not because anyone asked them, but because at that point it was simply expected, I guess. Like, a government official did something for you, so now you have to give them a bonus. That's just the common thing. It's like tipping. Dear God, no, actually imagine at that point if you went down to like the local DMV or something, and after you got your license, they flipped the thing around here, the computer, for you to go and type in how much you want to tip them. That's what we're talking about here. This became so incredibly normalized that in comparison to when someone just directly demands a bribe, that number was only around 14% of cases. Now, for those of you who are wondering, okay, why would any of these bribes occur? Well, the main purpose of paying bribes in Serbia are to speed up a procedure, which is about 34% of cases. 18% of cases are to receive better treatment because someone is basically just ignoring you the whole time and refuses to do anything with you. And on that note, another 18% is to finalize a procedure because after going through a whole process, they just wouldn't stamp the last of your paperwork before finishing something off until it is that you bribed them. In fact, what is crazy about this is that among all the different ways that bribes can take place within the country, more than half of bribe payers in Serbia are paying kickbacks to doctors. Yes, 55% of all bribes are dedicated to medical payments, to direct payments to doctors. More than 1/3 are to police officers, which I guess is something that arguably makes a little bit more sense considering when we're talking about bribing people to look the other way when committing a crime. That's 39%. And then the last biggest case is to nurses. Again, moving back into medical bribe payments. This is obviously not a good scenario, and less than 1% of Serbian citizens who experience bribery actually report the incidents in which they are extorted for bribes in the first place. Oftentimes, citizens don't even report bribes because in most of the cases, as I already said, they initiated the payments on their own in the first place because they perceive that they are receiving some kind of benefit from it, or because, they gave it voluntarily as a sign of gratitude. This is already bad enough when it comes to payments, but this is something that pervades through many aspects of public life within Serbia. Perceptions of widespread corruption in the public sector are backed up by the experience of around 6% of newly recruited public officials, who in the 3 years prior to the survey taking place back in 2011 would state that they secured their job because they bribed someone to be able to get it. In fact, when bringing up officials and politics, the offer of goods, favors, and money to attract voters, this is something that had a lot of evidence during the last local and nationalist elections. Arguably, 7% of citizens were approached at local elections, and another 7% at the last parliamentary or presidential elections in order to be bribed to vote a set way. This is such a big problem within Serbia that corruption has a higher prevalence rate than other crimes. It has a higher rate than theft, burglary, robbery, assault, and anything else that you can think of. It is the most common crime, which is pretty bad. But, and I'm not just going into specifics when I say that, it's not just bribes that we're talking about here. Zoning laws, lease agreements, safety inspections, and so much more are wrapped up in this issue of corruption, which over time has increasingly angered the public, which has lost faith with their governing bodies to actually, well, run the country properly. In response to everything that I have described, the SNS political party, the thing that was founded among others by the current president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, would use this corruption in order to discredit the DS and win its way into power. This is how the modern political party of Serbia came into existence in the first place. The SNS would make corruption controls, EU integration, and dialogue with Kosovo their main points in their campaign for the 2012 elections. And when this happened, not only would they win because the public just wanted some kind of change, but after this, the SNS would remain in power ever since then. And then, despite promises, corruption did not go away. No, instead, it allowed the SNS party to consolidate power. You see, my friends, very quickly after taking power, the SNS party would begin to appoint loyalists to key positions in state-owned enterprises, into regulatory bodies, and other institutions that control aspects of the government. This helped the party exert control over various aspects of Serbian society and the economy, with one of the key important areas being the varying different agencies that were tasked with handling corruption. You can probably then imagine how exactly that goes. You see, the SNS would use various different tactics to unfairly reduce the opposition's electoral prospects in order to maintain control of political power. These would include manipulating the timing of snap elections, exerting pressure on independent state institutions to support them, busing in voters from neighboring territories, and mobilizing public resources in order to support its campaigns versus that of opposition parties. We're talking using actual public funds and agencies to support them, the ruling party, versus staying neutral. And of course, people will naturally notice that, hey, something is going on over time. And that is precisely why the SNS would expand its influence over the media through its effective control of both state-owned enterprises as well as an array of private outlets that were dependent upon government funding. Through these efforts, the party would harness this influence to strengthen its political position and discredit its rivals, further reducing opposition parties' competitiveness as, well, they simply did not have much reach. With time, opposition figures would face escalating harassment, intimidation, violence, manipulation, all of which would result in suppression of opposition parties' political representation at just about every level across Serbian society. And when I say this, my friends, just allow me to provide one example of corruption in media. Let me present to you the case of Telekom Serbia. When I go and explain this, my friends, the Telekom Serbia corruption scandal involves allegations of corruption, embezzlement, and cronyism surrounding the Serbian state-owned telecommunications company, Telekom Serbia. Now, this scandal is something that emerged back in the 2010s and has really been ongoing ever since, with new things coming out every so often despite varying different government efforts to shut down said investigations. These different things often would shed light on the extent of the corruption in Serbian society, which is something that the government has not really wanted to showcase. At the center of this scandal are allegations that high-ranking government officials, including President Aleksandar Vučić and other members of the ruling Serbian Progressive Party, the SNS, would use their positions to enrich themselves and their associates through corrupt dealings with the company. And when I say this, there are quite a number of allegations, including embezzlement, in which millions of euros were allegedly embezzled from Telekom Serbia through fake contracts, overpriced services, and other schemes. They would push through cronyism, in which government officials would allegedly use their influence to secure lucrative contracts and deals for themselves and their associates. Once they had this money, they would be accused of laundering it. Allegations suggest that some of the embezzled funds were laundered through offshore accounts and shell companies, which were then unable to be tracked. To get those contracts in the first place, officials allegedly accepted bribes in order to be able to secure them for friends, family members, and foreign nationals. As time went on and the scope of the scandal came to light, it would lead to numerous different investigations, arrests, and convictions. However, at the same time that I say that, many critics still argue that the investigations that have been done are inadequate, that there are simply so many more people that are not being addressed because they are high-ranking officials that have been protected from any kind of real accountability. Mind you, when I say that, that is only one case of corruption within a media service. There are so many more that I could cover within Serbia, and this is one of the reasons why when looking at this in the first place, I thought, okay, this is going to be a short video. No, it's not. No, it's simply not. Through control of the media, the SNS party has not only been able to enrich itself, but simultaneously with time has been able to influence public perception and also consolidate power behind the scenes. Through this effort, which is something that would go and aid their campaigns, the SNS with time was able to successfully co-opt some opposition parties by offering them ministerial positions or other forms of cooperation if they helped them to take power. This is something that over the years would weaken the opposition's ability to challenge the ruling party effectively. And so through a combination of coalition building, which mind you when I say that, that is most certainly not illegal, that is something that is done all the time, they were able to take power. But after doing so, this is something that would enable them to be able to make changes that would help them stay in power. From this then, the SNS has maintained a tight grip on parliament since 2012. That level of control allows the party to pass legislation that is favorable to its interests without any significant opposition. And as a result, corruption across the board has been able to flourish. Which, when I say that, allow me to just list a few examples, and none of these are necessarily in any kind of real chronological order. I could go on and on about so many more of these, but I'm only going to list a few of them. First, we have the Krušik scandal. For those that have not heard this before, the Krušik scandal refers to a corruption affair involving the Serbian arms company Krušik, which has been implicated in various different scandals, including arms trading and export. The scandal gained significant attention back in the year 2019 when an employee of the company would leak files that allegedly implicated the father of Serbia's interior minister, Nebojša Stefanović, in a corruption affair. In November of 2018, the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, or BIRN, whose work I'm actually going to be citing quite a bit over the course of this video, they would publish leaked documents that seemed to show that Branko Stefanović, father of Nebojša Stefanović, would visit state arms manufacturer Krušik. His name was listed as one of 3 representatives of GIM, an arms export company. Multiple leaks and reports, all of them fiercely denied by the government, would then since indicate that Branko Stefanović would play a major role in the export firm. Internal documents would seem to show that Krušik would sell GIM millions of dollars in weapons at very low prices, like well below what it is that they should have been. These weapons were then resold to foreign buyers at a higher price, and from there we can then guess that the difference was pocketed. Now, the biggest red flag in this entire case is arguably where the weapons ended up in the first place. Bulgaria-based Arms Watch would claim that Krušik-made weapons ended up with jihadist forces in Syria as well as Yemen, and were even being used by Ukrainian forces against pro-Russian separatists in 2019. The reports on Ukraine actually carry a very significant weight and are important with Serbia because traditionally, Serbia has been allied with Russia, though their breaking of that alliance and drifting apart is something that probably should be done in a whole other separate video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. Anyway, the whistleblower who leaked the files was arrested and labeled a spy by the Serbian government shortly afterwards in 2019. However, not only would this individual claim that he was not a spy for foreign powers, he would claim that he was trying to help and had even gone and informed the Serbian Defense Ministry and President Aleksandar Vučić about the situation at the military industry plant, but no action was taken in the first place. In response to all of this, things got murky very fast. The Arms Watch website that was talking about this in the first place was temporarily brought down by denial of service attacks, DOS attacks, within 2 hours of publishing its Krušik research in September. According to the website's hosting provider, the attacks came from Serbia specifically. And in order to keep the website online, they were forced to activate DOS protection and make the article inaccessible from the country for several days. As for why someone would be so brazen about this in the first place, it seems that the attackers knew that their activities would be traced, and that visits from Serbia would be halted to the website, which in turn was exactly what they wanted. They wanted the information to stop going to Serbians. Of course, Interior Minister Stefanovic would slam the entire thing as a massive lie, intending to harm him and his family. He would also repeatedly deny any connection between his father and GIM. Yet, at the same time, his statements seemed to contradict the documents that were published by BIRN. The outlet would claim that Branko Stefanovic was part of a GIM delegation that had visited Saudi Arabia in 2018. In fact, a visa application sent to the Saudi embassy in Sarajevo would list Stefanovic as GIM's legal advisor. The title legal advisor would even be visible on the photo showing his Saudi visa, and this was published. So, yeah, there is a connection, and it's documented. Verbally denying that doesn't really change anything. This is not the only case that would end up happening with Kursk. These arms exports were going on for quite a while. And in 2023, it was reported that Serbia had denied delivering 3,500 Grad G2000 rockets manufactured by Kursk via Turkey and then Slovakia. In a related case to this, an informational video by Friendly Jordies, who is another YouTuber, you can actually go and check out his video, he would go in detail the bombing of Papuan villages by the Indonesian government using these rockets. This is a case that has not ended, it is still ongoing. Anyway, moving on from that, the second example that I will bring up is the Belgrade Waterfront Project scandal. The Belgrade Waterfront Project corruption scandal is something that refers to the controversial and, well, allegedly corrupt development of a large-scale real estate project in Belgrade, Serbia. This is a project which was initiated back in 2012 at the time that the SNS took power, and it is something that aimed to transform the city's waterfront area into a modern downtown district with luxury apartments, offices, and shopping centers, essentially reviving the entire region. According to various different reports and investigations, the project is something that was plagued by corruption, lack of transparency, and just straight up disregard for the law entirely. The Serbian government, led by President Aleksandar Vučić, would be accused of pushing forward the project without any proper public consultation, environmental impact assessments, or just even in general a competitive bidding process to make things in the first place. Like, one of the main concerns surrounding the whole project was the involvement of a development group called Eagle Hills, a developer based in Abu Dhabi, which was appointed, not granted, appointed as the primary investor without any kind of public offering. The company's CEO, Muhammad Alabar, was known for his close ties to the Serbian government and had previously invested in other projects in the country. With the project's cost being estimated to be around $4 billion and having been granted to a single group without any kind of real consultation or competitor who could offer potentially a better price, this is something that was very sketchy, and it is something that was directly to be covered by foreign direct investment. However, opponents of the project would question how exactly these costs were supposed to be met and who was going to benefit from them in the first place. Things would still proceed with time. However, it created quite a bit of tension. In 2016, thousands of everyday Serbians would take to the streets to protest against an incident where dozens of men with masks would move in, demolishing buildings in the area where the Belgrade waterfront complex was planned to be built. Like, just guys in masks with baseball bats showing up to the place where all this, well, not deconstruction, what's the word I'm looking for here? Demolition. Why did I forget that word? They showed up here to intimidate the population and begin demolition, while the government would deny any responsibility or knowledge of the event. Of course, people naturally didn't believe it. This would in turn result in a very interesting scenario for the protest that, for anyone who is curious about seeing this, they can go and look this up, and I know that my editor is going to put it up right now, but thousands of protesters would go through the streets with signs of ducks on them in order to protest this thing. The word duck in Serbian means fraud, and so it's a symbolic way of saying that the project is really the Belgrade water fraud, not waterfront. It's a pun that happens with that. The people pushing for the project were not just crazy, they were quacks. Don't hate me, please. Anyway, thousands of outraged citizens would be waving the signs and would join protests, before eventually, later on, Prime Minister Aleksandar Vučić would admit that city officials were in fact behind the episode in the first place. Like, the very thing that they were denying, that no, they were not involved with the masked men and the demolition and all this, that was a completely separate group. Yeah, no, they were a part of it, and they would even admit this later on. That is already bad enough, but even further controversy would surround the adoption at this time of special laws that allowed for expedited expropriation procedures and exemptions from environmental regulations when it came to building codes. I know that that sounds very wordy and not necessarily interesting, but I promise you this whole thing is really sleazy. Transparency International would even note that the laws that we're talking about here were tailor-made for specific projects like Belgrade Waterfront in order to be able to abuse things. Which, in turn, that's what we're going to be talking about as our third sketchy example of corruption. To explain this, Serbia's 2015 law on legalization of buildings was something that was hailed at the time as being a silver bullet for the decades-old scourge of illegal construction in Belgrade. Which, when I talk about this is a problem that dated back decades, all the way to when Yugoslavia was still a communist state, as what would happen is people would be able to go and just build a property on pretty much anything, and then just there was no problem. There was nothing that was zoned properly for it. You could bribe an official to look the other way, and you could build a house wherever, regardless of what actually was supposed to be going there. This is something that would only multiply with the political, social, and economic turmoil of the 1990s and 2000s, which led to a very ramshackle city design. So the idea of all this was very simple. The concept was clear. The state was going to ignore all the illegal construction that was complete before July of 2015, and they were going to demolish anything that was built afterwards that did not have a permit. In order to figure this out, they were not going to rely on simple government documents, because many of these things would be forged or changed in some way in order to be able to accommodate corrupt practices. Instead, what they would do is they would rely on satellite images. Simply take a before and take an after, and then if someone claimed that a building was built after the time, or rather I say built before the time, then they would be able to check the satellite images in order to be able to see what was actually there in the first place. And if construction had started on something before July of 2015, and they can see that through the satellite image, it's fine. Totally fine. Sounds simple, right? Well, here's the thing. Months of research by the BIRN would end up showing that 450,000 square meters of residential property in the capital was either partially or completely built without permits since 2015. This is something that managed to escape demolition, and somehow many of these even be legalized. Based on the satellite images used by the state, BIRN managed to build a database of more than 300 different buildings, with the majority of them being residential buildings larger than 1,000 square meters that were fully or partially illegally built after 2015 and were subsequently then legalized in violation of the law. This is only what they just found by a glance, mind you. The true number is likely much higher, and the value of these properties can range from tens of millions to hundreds of millions of euros. The big question is, why would someone want to do this? Well, there are a number of benefits that specifically make people want to be corrupt. Investors would benefit because they would pay less in terms of fees for legalization and bribing an official than they would for actually paying for the development of construction land. So if they were going to buy a property and develop it legally, maybe they have to pay €1 million, or they could just start building on something and say, oh, I bought this and did this thing for €100,000 years ago, and then pay an official another €50,000 to cover the cost of it, and then they just make the whole thing up. Which would be the savings in that scenario of the thing that I just built of like €850,000 if that's the case. Investors would profit from this kind of financial structure, but the problem is it means that the state would not get any of the actual money that they were supposed to get because of the illegal zoning. As an example of just one of the cases in which this happens, in May of 2022, an individual by the name of Aleksandar Vučić, the former head of Palilula municipality, the largest municipality in Belgrade, was indicted on abuse of office charges. Prosecutors would accuse him of taking bribes from investors in return for leaning on municipal building inspectors to help facilitate their illegal construction in Palilula. Now, Vučić, who was a senior member of the ruling Progressive Party, would naturally deny doing anything wrong. He had done nothing illegal. Yet, still, before the case went to trial, 7 building inspectors and 2 investors would already make a plea bargain with prosecutors to help confirm his guilt. In another example, for the entire period in question from 2015, when the project was supposed to start, to July of 2022, the Secretariat for Legalization Affairs was led by Progressive Party member Nemanja Stajic. BIRN would report that Stajic was responsible for the illegal legalization of a property to the benefit of a company that was owned by his brother, Novak, which, as you can imagine, is a bit of a conflict of interests. Now, when I describe this here, my friends, that is not to say necessarily that the government did absolutely nothing, that this was just horribly blatant corruption that was out in the open, which it kind of was, but the government still tried to do something, or at least curb excesses. In November of 2018, as an example, the Serbian parliament would amend the law on legalization and the law on planning and construction to make satellite image checks mandatory in the case of all objects subject to legalization. And also at the same time, bigger fines were introduced in order to stop people from doing these things. But still, despite all of that, the problem would continue. In a later case that was reported by BIRN, the Progressive Party member Aleksandar Vučić would manage to legalize one of his own buildings after becoming mayor of Belgrade in June of 2022. This being despite the fact that he had not fulfilled all of the legal conditions to be able to do this in the first place. Naturally, he would deny doing anything wrong, but, you know, when you had power, when you were the mayor, and supported by the party that was in charge of everything in the country, you could pretty much do whatever it is you wanted. This, as you can imagine, is a pretty deep and widespread problem, and critics of the government argue that Vučić's administration uses its authority to circumvent existing laws and push through projects that benefit their allies rather than serving public interests. In doing this, they're able to enrich their friends and family rather than actually building things that people want or need. These allegations and concerns about corruption were only further made more difficult by authorities avoiding accountability through judicial means, as well as selective prosecution. In other words, although they could prosecute some members of their party who were very obviously and egregiously doing things, they could mostly sweep things under the rug and then at the same time go after people that were in the opposition or others and selectively choose to arrest and take out people. With the fact that the state controlled much of the media, it means that they also simultaneously would be able to control the public narrative. And look, at this point, we've been going on about all this for a while, and I said from the beginning, this was supposed to be a short video. My wife is already mad at me that I've taken as long as I have because this took multiple days to research and create. It's not a short video. I get it. I could go on and on about even more corruption cases within Serbia, like I've done in the past on different episodes, but we need to move forward here to an election and then the protest to wrap things up. So, my friends, without going into too much detail, 2023 heading into 2024 was interesting politically. According to reports, the 2024 Serbian elections were marred by allegations of voter fraud, with opposition parties accusing the ruling party of manipulating the voting process to secure their victory. These allegations include reports of vote buying, falsifying ballots and signatures, as well as manipulation of voter registration. In fact, international monitors from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, would report that the elections were held in, quote, unjust conditions and noted numerous irregularities, including just basically a lack of transparency. The Electoral Commission was criticized for lacking transparency in its decision-making process, which made it very difficult to track the actual voting process. They were accused of vote buying, with people being offered different sums of money or other incentives to vote for the ruling party. Opposition parties during this time would report falsified ballots, that some ballots were just tampered with in order to favor the ruling party. This is then only made worse by allegations that the ruling party had manipulated voter registration lists to either exclude opposition supporters or add fake voters who would in turn vote for them. Of course, the European Parliament would express concerns about the conduct of the elections and urged an international investigation into allegations of voter fraud. However, the Serbian government would end up blocking this investigation, with Prime Minister Ana Brnabić, which, to say that name slowly enough sounds really funny, stating that she would never allow an international investigation into Serbia's electoral process. As you can imagine, from everything that I've described, tensions have been very high in Serbia for the past year, and further because of everything that we have described with the corruption cases already. The events that would take place in November, though, that would be the straw that broke the camel's back. You see, my friends, the Novi Sad railway station collapse would lead to a political crisis in Serbia due to widespread dissatisfaction with the government's handling of the incident and underlying issues such as we've already covered: nepotism, corruption, a lack of transparency, and more. The collapse, which killed 15 people, was seen as extremely preventable, something that really should not have happened, but was caused by shoddy renovation work and a culture of impunity in which the government would simply sweep things under the rug. The opposition parties in Serbia were very quick to attack President Vučić and his progressive party government, arguing that the tragedy was a result of corruption and a lack of accountability. The protests that would follow the collapse were not just about the incident itself, but also about the broader issues of government corruption, media censorship, and more that we've been covering over the course of this video, which is specifically why I went into detail about all of that in the first place. Again, we have to cover everything when talking about it. In fact, what is so nasty about all of this is that the railway station had been renovated twice in recent years. It's not like something had been ignored for 40, 50, 60 years without being looked at. They had already renovated it, and yet still this happened. And so critics would blame the shoddy work on widespread corruption and a lack of transparency, which would only make people further upset. The renovations were part of a broader agreement with Chinese construction firms, which we've talked about here in the past, and that raised questions about the government's dealings with foreign companies and the potential for corrupt practices. Again, something that is commonly associated with Chinese firms. The protests that followed the collapse were widespread, with tens of thousands of people gathering in cities across Serbia in order to demand accountability and call for an end to corruption. The protests would continue even after 13 officials were indicted in connection to the collapse, indicating that the public's trust in the government had severely eroded by this point, that they weren't simply going to back down. And so now, my friends, in just the past week, Prime Minister Milos Vučić would become the highest-ranking official to step down, with his resignation being something that has destabilized Vučić's government and prompted the opposition to call for the formation of an interim government. In a televised address, Vučić would state that his party would take 10 days to decide whether to form a majority government or just hold snap parliamentary elections, saying that, quote, the new election could be held in April, but an interim government is out of the question. This sounds like a really big deal, and it is. It definitely is. But a change in the head of government is arguably less significant than it might initially appear. This being because even if the prime minister is stepping down, the real power in Serbia is not held by him, it is held by Vučić. Vučić, who is a trusted ally of the president, said that he hoped that his decision to quit as prime minister would encourage protesters to calm down the passions and return to dialogue. But that hasn't really happened. It's something that may just pave the way for new parliamentary elections. If a new prime minister is not appointed within the next 30 days of the National Assembly confirming the resignation, who really knows? Vučić has also been pushing the idea of an advisory referendum on his own role, saying that he would stand down if he lost the vote. However, at this point, a change in power really seems unlikely. As I've already covered over the course of this video, the ruling Serbian Progressive Party is very well organized, and international election monitors have already noted that it dominates Serbia's media space and has experienced quite a number of voter irregularities. It comfortably won the recent parliamentary elections just over a year ago, even with the allegations of irregularities that have happened. In contrast, the opposition remains fractured and without many allies to be able to support them. So, as it stands, the reaction of protesters may be crucial to actually knowing what is going to happen next. If enough of these protesters view the prime minister's resignation or the firing of other officials as a significant development, then maybe the demonstrations could fizzle out in a similar way that other previous anti-government movements have happened in the past decade within the state. But if they decide to carry on protesting, the amount of chaos and turbulence in Serbia could continue. And at that point, who knows what kind of violence we could see here in 2025. But, my friends, as it stands, that right now is all the story that I can really tell here. This already went on for way longer than I was supposed to in the first place, and it's kind of a messy thing. When something happens, when there are further developments, you can be sure that we're going to cover it, and we're going to explain how it is that we got there. But I wanted to create this episode after seeing just how much corruption there was in Serbia, and if there's any other states or other things that you would like for me to cover and explain the story of, let me know in the comment section below. This has been Sakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you all very much. And remember, as I've always talked about, wait, things get worse. At the same time, even if everything is on fire and looks like it's going to blow up, nah, don't worry, everything is fine. My new merch line just dropped, and if there's anyone who wants to support my channel by getting a shirt, you should feel free to check out down in the description. My friends, thank you all very much. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you here next time. Goodbye, my friends.